I'm going to give the source, all right, for the passages. Do you want me to give the source?
Sure.
Okay,
Okay. Are we rolling? Yes, I am.
we're rolling.
Okay.
This is from the introduction to Part 2 of The Rights of Man. What Archimedes said of the mechanical powers may be applied to reason and liberty. Had we, said he, a place to stand upon, we might raise the world. The Revolution of America presented in politics what was only theory in mechanics. So deeply rooted were all the governments of the old world, and so effectually had the tyranny and the antiquity of habit established itself over the mind, that no beginning could be made in Asia, Africa, or Europe to reform the political condition of man. Freedom had been hunted round the globe, reason was considered as rebellion, and the slavery of fear had been, freedom,
Okay, so we're going to change
okay.
for maybe go back.
Let me do it again, because now I'm all right. I'll just do it again from the top.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is from the introduction to Part 2 of The Rights of Man. What Archimedes said of the mechanical powers may be applied to reason and liberty. Had we, said he, a place to stand upon, we might raise the world. The Revolution of America presents in politics what was only theory in mechanics. So deeply rooted were all the governments of the old world, and so effectually had the tyranny and the antiquity of habit established itself over the mind, that no beginning could be made in Asia, Africa, or Europe to reform the political condition of man. Freedom had been hunted round the globe. Reason was considered as rebellion, and the slavery of fear had made men afraid to think. But such is the irresistible nature of truth, that all it asks and all it wants is the liberty of appearing. The sun needs no inscription to distinguish him from darkness, and no sooner did the American governments display themselves to the world than despotism felt a shock, and man began to The sun needs no inscription to distinguish him from darkness, and no sooner did the American governments display themselves to the world than despotism felt a shock, and man began to contemplate redress. The independence of America, considered merely as a separation from England, would have been a matter but of little importance, had it not been accompanied by a revolution in the principles and practice of governments. She made a stand, not for herself only, but for the world.
How do you react to this?
Can I just stop for just a second? Okay. I'm going.
Okay. How do you react to that? I mean, it makes me feel funny. I don't know.
It occurs to me that Paine was a poet. Thomas Paine was a poet. And when he set his pen to the page, he was able to retrieve from the depths of human consciousness and a kind of wisdom irretrievable by other means. When he set the pen to the page, he was able to tap something of the human spirit, unable to be tapped by other means. And so the language that he could bring forth to the page was a poet's language. And this is why we have metaphors of illumination throughout his work, the sun illuminating the darkness, and why he was so interested in candle flames and in the production of smokeless candles. He was always interested in having that little spark that would displace darkness. And in this particular passage, he's telling us that all we need to do is believe it. We need to believe in our own power to govern ourselves. We need to believe in the human capacity to achieve sovereignty over itself, collectively, to achieve it. And I think that Paine's language was performative. It was a language that encouraged people to not only to hear and to comprehend, but to perform. He was someone who could take fire and light it in the hearts of others. He wasn't someone who kept the fire to himself.
You know, basically, he said you can change the world.
Mm-hmm.
if you could just talk about that, because we're also talking about not only the language of poetry, but the language of revolution. And that's
He was talking about a place to stand upon which he located within the hearts and minds of enlightened men and women, rather than in a physical sphere. And I think what he was talking about was a kind of ability to achieve the leverage that Archimedes theorized possible, but it was a leverage to raise the condition of man. And I think what he was trying to tell us was that if we stand together and stand in a place enlightened and willing to make sacrifices on behalf of each other and for each other, everything is possible.
how is this a radical idea? So,
Why is this a radical idea?
yeah.
He was challenging the order of governments of conquest and hereditary power. And the notion that human beings could govern themselves collectively and wisely was the radical notion. It still is a radical notion, which is why Tom Paine is still a threat. I'd like to try another, which is something that was important to me. It wasn't marked by you, but one of the great advantages of the American Revolution has been that it led to a discovery of the principles and laid open the imposition of governments. All the revolutions till then had been worked within the atmosphere of the court and never on the great floor of the nation. The parties were always of the class of courtiers, and whatever was their rage for reformation, they carefully preserved the fraud of the profession. In all cases, they took care to represent government as a thing made up of mysteries, which only themselves understood. And they hid from the understanding of the nation the only thing that was beneficial to know, namely, that government is nothing more than a national association acting on the principles of society. That government is nothing more than a national association acting on the principles of society. This is important to me because Paine was a demystifier. Paine took the rhetoric of mystification, which is we can't understand, we're common people, we have no background to govern, we're ill-equipped, and he demystified the process point by point in his writings. He was a very systematic thinker, and he understood the need of the common man to understand a process systematically and logically. He revolutionized language for the common man, political language. It's never been the same since Thomas Paine. He was able, in responding to Edmund Burke, the whole of the Rights of Man was a response to Edmund Burke, and Edmund Burke's language in his own document was filled with Latin phrases and periodic sentences, very convoluted sentences. He was writing to an audience of the learned. Paine's response was not to respond in kind with the same language, but with a language that arose from his own being and his own clarity of understanding. He was able to isolate those aspects of a complex situation which were most telling, and then to provide that as an example so that common people could understand the great complexity, the so-called complexity of governance. He was even able to explain taxation, which I think was quite remarkable and would be remarkable today, to be able to explain to the common people where tax money goes and how it's collected and what might justify it and who should decide who has the authority to tax.
You're a poet, and in a way, what you're giving is the definition of poetry. Is that correct?
Clarity, compression, concision, compassion. A quality of feeling and a sensibility that allows us to understand that what we are hearing is the voice of a human being, not the collective voice of a committee or the voice of a hired speechwriter or the voice of a collective of hired speechwriters. Or what we're hearing is a human heart, the articulacy of a human intelligence that is willing to take responsibility for what it says, is willing to to stand on the ground of its own articulation and say, this is what I believe. And I'm going to express this regardless of my anticipation of the electoral outcome or any other outcome. Which is why someone like Thomas Paine or someone like Václav Havel, the president of the Czech Republic, so startle in their language politicians of our own time, I think. I think politicians of our own time are very worried and calculating when it comes to their perception of how they might please the largest majority of the electorate, not realizing that if the electorate hears in their words a human being willing to take responsibility for what he or she says, willing to stand on principle, willing to take the risk of saying the unpopular thing. And I think that kind of language is unmistakable when heard. I think that's the kind of language that we're missing now in our own level of political discourse in our country and perhaps in others.
Is this one of the reasons why we're still interested in pain? I mean, is this part of it? Well, how come anyone cares about someone that died 200 years ago? You know? He was ready for his time, wasn't he? Sure.
He invented human rights, the principle of human rights. For myself, as a poet, this was a concern that brought me of age ethically and morally in my own time. And when I researched the origin of thinking about human rights, it led me directly to the rights of man, to the writings of Thomas Paine. And that's how I discovered him. He certainly wasn't emphasized in my education. He wasn't one of the founding fathers most often quoted or most often cited, and he's not the one they build monuments to, but he is the one who brought a quality of humanity, compassion, and ethics to the political word. And while one sees in him tremendous arguments for anti-militarism, for instance, that make more sense today even than at the time he articulated them. And he also makes arguments for societal compassion. There is a thinking in ethics that no society can consider itself ethical until the least of its members feel safe. And this was something that Thomas Paine understood. He reasoned the provision of aid to poor widows and younger children and the elderly, and he was able to argue concretely and I think economically as well as morally and ethically the reasons that such provision would further secure the state rather than jeopardize it.
There's the line, I mean, for him it's not charity. What I like about it is they're right. It's not.
It's right. It is the moral and humane and ethical thing to do. He said something like, my country is the world and my religion is to do good. Simple, understandable, and radical. Another passage? Would you like another one?
Yeah, sure.
It could have been no difficult thing in the early and solitary ages of the world, while the chief employment of men was that of attending flocks and herds, for a banditti of ruffians to overrun a country and lay it under contributions. Their power being thus established, the chief of the band contrived to lose the name of robber in that of monarch, and hence the origin of monarchy and kings. So you see, Paine also had a tremendous wit, but he's on to something here which I think is very important and which we experience in our own day. I feel it as a need to maintain a rigorous and vigilant study of euphemisms in my day. What is a freedom fighter to one is a dangerous guerrilla soldier to another. What is a warlord to some is a militia leader to another. What is a robber to some is a monarch to another. And this is the power of language, to affix identity, to stabilize identity, and sometimes to obfuscate or occult or cover the true nature of something. And I think what Paine, I'm sorry, I'm used to talking about Ezra Pound. And I think what Thomas Paine was doing, he was, I think, making an heroic attempt to disclose language, to uncover that which had been obfuscated by terms like monarchy, and to show them for what they were and for the assumptions behind them.
Can you connect this with today? I know you've had some grisly experiences in the third world with raw power, and if you could just talk about pain and today, because pain talks about people taking power.
Pain is an empowering writer, and he is empowering not for himself, as he often articulated, but on behalf of others. In fact, he was always very careful to ascertain the interests of people who presumed to speak for the society. And he was always digging into the particular motivations of people who would presume to speak for the people as a whole. In my own experience, I think that one of the examples I think that is most familiar to all of us is the example of the euphemisms of the military, the examples of something like mad or mutually assured destruction. There's something about the word assurance embedded in the phrase that calms us when we shouldn't be calmed.
What's that other term, collateral damage? Did you hear that term, collateral damage?
Yes, there's collateral damage, and then there's preemptive strike, which is, of course, not the same as attacking first, is it? It's somehow the prerogative to preempt something that would have happened anyway, or we're assuming it would have, and so on. So it becomes very complex and confusing. And Thomas Paine was one of the first masters, I think, of the art, and it is an art, of disclosing the meanings buried in language that have kept us from seeing our own structures, our own civil structures. And I think he said as much many times, especially in The Rights of Man.
I want to ask you some questions about the language of revolution. Do you think there is a language of revolution? And if you could just take us through.
The language of revolution is always the language of resistance to tyranny. Any language of revolution that is not a language of resistance to tyranny is an ideologically based and possibly fraudulent language. If tyranny and oppression can be identified, and a language formed to resist it, not only to denounce, there is that stage of denunciation of bringing the sin to the eye, of helping others to see that there is a wrong. This is so much the work of human rights activists, to bring the knowledge of torture and political confinement to the rest of the world, hoping for some sort of redress or assistance. This denunciation stage is part of the language of revolution, but so is the language of finding the means to resist and of empowering people to join together in resistance, and of allowing an articulation, of finding an articulation of the sometimes intricate and difficult to locate sphere of collectivity, of how it is that we are interdependent with each other and intersubjective, and that what we are, sometimes it's a question of stripping rhetoric away and of finding the plain language of the common action that the moment so requires and that no one's been able to say. Why should we live as herd animals? Why should power be hereditary? Why should power be inherited?
Why should power be in Washington?
Well,
Paine is often dismissed as being, he's the spark. He started the revolution, but after the revolution gets going, we don't need him anymore. Is that your reading?
I think we needed him more. He was the spark, but he not only, through common sense, allowed the people of this continent to perceive the injustice of foreign rule and the injustice of their own system. He was also, throughout the Revolutionary War, able to identify moments of crisis and respond to them. And very many of his papers on crisis were, I think, very helpful toward the American effort to win the war. So throughout the war that was true, and then again and again and again as issues came up, he the issue of the Bank of North America, for instance. He would address those issues in language that didn't always successfully move legislators, but I think articulated much needed positions at that time. So he was helpful to inspire the revolution, to sustain the revolution even militarily, and then to connect the principles of that revolution to other revolutions in France and in England, and to allow the flowering of the American Revolution to bestow its fruits on England at a time of great need for England. So I think he was always trying to build his iron bridge. You remember the story, he was trying to achieve a bridge that would not need any piers in the water because he was afraid that ice would strike these piers and cause the bridge to collapse. So he wanted an iron bridge that would completely span the water, and he had designed it in the design of a spider web. He was never actually to see his bridge into being. I think his iron bridge was the bridge from hope to realization of democracy, and from one country to another, hope to realization of democracy. That was his iron bridge.
Not for nothing, but I think that's great.
Okay, what are we going to do now?
Just one more thing.
Do you want more passages?
I have another question.
Okay.
Which is, can you make a revolution from words, or does something already have to be present? You know, the whole idea of common sense.
Paine answers that. There's a passage which directly answers that, and that is the passage that has to do with appearing, yes. He says, wait a minute, I've got to find it. It's important. So you're saying, does it pre-exist its articulacy in language? Is that what you're saying?
Well, is it already there? I mean, the question is, can words make a revolution, or are they the fuel of something that's? Is it only valid if it's fueling something that's already there?
I think I'll bypass the excerpts and just answer from my own understanding of Thomas Paine. Language alone can't make a revolution. I think that we have lived during the Cold War period with a kind of obfuscated understanding of the true nature of revolution, because we have fixed the term often to revolutions associated with Marxist-Leninism in impoverished countries in Latin America and so on, and in Asia. Revolution is highly complex. It is a moment of, Immanuel Kant calls enlightenment the coming out of immaturity and the realization that one can think for oneself. Revolution is the collective moment of that occurrence, I think. A society, for many reasons, some of them connected to each other and some of them inspiring firestorms of indeterminacy, something that it can't really be manipulated from without. This is an illusion that we've had during the Cold War period. It's not something that an agitator can produce, in language or otherwise. It is a moment that a people are ready for. It is a moment when a people collectively emerge as ready for change, and someone comes along from their midst to articulate their dream of that change. That was Thomas Paine for the American Revolution. Oh, God.
I'd love you to read the passage about poor and rich.
Yes, okay. The Army of Principles, or?
No, to see poor and rich people together.
Okay.